In the spring of 1985, a man walked into a sporting goods store in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and bought sleeping bags. Nobody knew that a few months later, those same bags would be pulled from the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, weighted down by cinder blocks, and zipped inside were the bodies of full-patch Hells Angels. Yet the answer to who killed those men was more terrifying than the crime itself. They were killed by their own brothers. But how does a brotherhood turn on itself? The answer lies in a war inside the club between two kinds of brothers, where one kind decided the other did not deserve to live. This is the story of the Lennoxville Massacre, the night the Hells Angels murdered their own. By the middle of the 1980s, the Hells Angels in Quebec were quietly at war with themselves, and the war was about what kind of criminals they were going to be. On one side stood the men of the North Chapter, based in Laval, just above Montreal. They had come up as Popeyes, the street gang the Angels had absorbed to plant their flag in Quebec, and they still behaved like it. They partied like outlaws from another era, drank hard, and above all, they used cocaine, constantly, including the cocaine they were supposed to be selling. Their president was Laurent Viau, a small man with unkempt long hair and a thick beard who had little interest in discipline, and under him the chapter had spun out of control. They snorted the profits. They skimmed money owed to other chapters. They treated the Hells Angels not as an organization they served, but as a party they belonged to. On the other side, at the Sorel clubhouse south of Montreal, stood a very different kind of angel, led by a man who did not look like a biker at all. His name was Réjean Lessard, and everyone called him Zig-Zag, a nickname earned because his sharply angled beard resembled the mascot printed on packages of Zig-Zag rolling papers. Lessard drove a sports car instead of a motorcycle. He wore clean white button-down shirts to hide his tattoos and make himself look like a businessman, because in his mind, that was exactly what a Hells Angel was becoming. He had been born into a comfortable middle-class family in Quebec's eastern townships, rejected all of it as a young man, and risen through the biker world to lead the most disciplined chapter in the province, forging tight alliances with the mafia and the West End gang, men who understood that drugs were a business and profit was the only religion. But Lessard had not always been the clean-shirted businessman. Rewind a few years and you'd have found a different man entirely. One of the sniffers himself. A serious cocaine addict. And not just any addict. A close friend of the man who would become the most prolific killer in Canadian history, Yves Trudeau. Lessard had come up in that world, breathed its smoke, lived by its appetites. Then his body turned on him. In 1983, the seizures started. Epileptic fits, made worse by everything he was pouring into himself. And faced with that, Lessard did something almost no one in that world had the will to do. He quit, cold. He walked away from the cocaine, went vegetarian, and rebuilt himself from the inside out. But here's the thing about a convert. Nobody hates the sin like the man who used to live it. Lessard didn't just leave his old life behind. He came to despise it. He looked at the North Chapter, at the men still living the way he used to, and he saw everything he'd clawed his way out of. He even had a name for them, spat out like a slur. Les sniffers, the sniffers. So understand what we're really looking at here. The man who would one day order 5 of his own brothers executed wasn't some cold outsider. He was a reformed addict, purging in them the version of himself he could no longer stand to see. The bad blood could have gone on for years. What ended it was money. One specific amount, $98,000. The trouble began with the club's most valuable and most dangerous asset, Yves Trudeau. Trudeau had carried out a contract for the West End gang, but when he went to collect his fee, he was told the cash wasn't there. Instead, he was told to go collect it himself, from his own brothers. The Hells Angels owed the West End gang money for cocaine. That was where Trudeau's payment was going to come from. So he traveled to Halifax, to the chapter run by David Carroll, Wolf. an ambitious, discipline-obsessed leader who had built the Nova Scotia Angels into a genuine crime syndicate. The Halifax chapter wasn't rich, but Carroll scraped it together anyway. $98,000, handed over in 2 installments. Most of it was Trudeau's, but a share was supposed to flow back to Laval. Then Carroll discovered where the money had actually gone. Most of it had gone straight up Trudeau's nose, converted into cocaine to feed a habit that at its worst was costing $25,000 a week. Carroll, a man who believed in the rules, was enraged that he had bled his own chapter to finance another man's addiction. And when the furious Carroll met with Lessard at the Sorel bunker in early 1985, Lessard poured fuel on the fire. The Laval chapter, he explained, was not just wasting money on drugs. It was actively robbing the rest of them, keeping the roughly $150,000 a week it earned from a speed lab it was running, instead of sharing the profits as club rules demanded. 2 of the most powerful leaders in the Eastern Canadian Hells Angels sat in that room and reached the same conclusion. The Laval chapter was a cancer and it had to be cut out. As Lessard would later put it, with chilling simplicity, in joining the Hells Angels, I signed up for criminality. In that milieu, it was the club above all else. I saw the ship sinking. There was one man in Laval who worried Lessard more than all the others, and it was Trudeau. Lessard told a young prospect that Trudeau had killed 60 people, a number even higher than the 43 the hitman would ever admit to, and that he was terrified of him, because Trudeau was known for one particular trait. He would kill anyone, even a fellow angel, if he was ordered to and the money was right. Lessard understood that a man like that, once cornered, might decide the leadership itself was his next target. So when the decision came to erase the Laval chapter, the club's own executioner was placed near the top of the list of men who had to die. In the language of the outlaw world, there is a phrase that carries more weight than almost any other: bad standing. To be a member in bad standing is to be stripped of the club's protection, marked as a problem, cut loose. And when an entire chapter is quietly declared to be in bad standing, it means something specific and final. It means a death sentence has been passed, not on one man, but on all of them. That is what happened to the North chapter. Lessard from Sorel, Carroll from Halifax, and Georges Beaulieu, the head of the Sherbrooke chapter, came together and agreed on something no Hells Angels leadership had ever done on this scale. The 3 most powerful chapters in Eastern Canada would unite to carry out the mass slaughter of their own members. Not a rival club, not an enemy. Their own brothers, men they had ridden with, patched in and called family. There would be a culling. And unlike almost every other killing in the history of the Hells Angels, this one would not be a burst of violence in the heat of a war. It would be planned, calmly and thoroughly, like a business closing an unprofitable division. The only difference was that this division was made of men, and closing it meant putting them in the ground. This was not a killing done in a moment of heat. It was assembled over days, one cold task at a time. Most of those tasks fell to a prospect named Jerry Coulombe. He wanted to earn his patch desperately, and to get it, he would carry out any order a full patch angel gave him. The first errand belonged to Georges Beaulieu, the president of the Sherbrooke chapter and one of the 3 leaders who had agreed the North chapter must die. He drove to a sporting goods store and bought sleeping bags. He paid in cash because a receipt could be traced, and these bags were meant to hold bodies. Little did anyone know whose bodies would be zipped inside them. Then came the list, and it passed to Coulombe, who immediately began working through it. He booked motel rooms for the guests coming in from out of town. He picked up a rented truck and left it at a Sorel shopping center with a box inside it. In the box were bottles of Javex and Mr. Clean, a pair of gloves, a parka, and a knife. Everything in that box was chosen to erase evidence. The bleach would wash away the blood. The gloves would keep fingerprints off anything the killers touched. And Coulombe was told to wear gloves himself and touch nothing, so that not a trace of him would be left behind either. Then they handed him the guns, pistols and revolvers rolled in rags, and sent him on to the clubhouse. The Hells Angels knew exactly how much killing was coming, and they went shopping for it first. Now the final task was to invite the victims, For this, Lessard gave orders to his right-hand man, a barrel-chested biker named Robert Richard, called T. Maigre, skinny, as a joke on his size. Richard put out the word to every Hells Angel in Quebec and Halifax. A mandatory meeting at the Sherbrooke bunker on the hill, the red-roofed clubhouse everyone called Lennoxville. Everyone must ensure their presence. And the men who most needed to be there were the men of the North Chapter, because the meeting was about them, and they did not know it yet. The date was set for March 23rd, 1985, and by then everything was ready. The bags, the bleach, the guns, and an army of loyal angels waiting inside the bunker for the men who were meant to die there. And then those men simply didn't come. Most of the North Chapter never showed up that night, not because they sensed a trap, but because they had no reason to. They knew nothing of what was waiting, and a mandatory meeting an hour and a half away could not compete with their own parties and their own business, so they stayed away. The most carefully built murder plot in the club's history had nearly fallen apart because its targets found it too dull to attend. But Lessard did not lose his nerve over it. He simply moved the date. The meeting would happen the next day instead, on Sunday, March 24th. And this time the summons carried a threat that any North Chapter member who failed to appear would be expelled from the club. In that world, expulsion was its own kind of death, and the threat did what the first invitation could not. The men who had shrugged off Saturday could not afford to shrug off Sunday, and so, this time, they came. The North Chapter men walked into the Lennoxville bunker and straight into an ambush, because at least 41 Hells Angels from Sorel, Sherbrooke, and Halifax were already waiting inside. The Laval men had come to a meeting, but everyone else in that clubhouse had come to a killing. Gilles Lachance was one of the few from the North Chapter that Lessard had chosen to spare, and he understood what was happening the moment he reached the vestibule, because he could hear the gunfire and the shouting from the room ahead before he ever saw it. Then a Sorel member turned a gun on him and told him that if he kept quiet, nothing would happen to him. So Lachance kept quiet, and he stepped into the room, and he saw all of it. 3 men were already on the floor and no longer moving. Jean-Guy Brutus Geoffrion, Jean-Pierre Matt Lecoisseur, Mathieu, and Michel Willie Mayrand. And standing over that scene, watching his own brother lie dead among them, was Richard Mayrand. He was a Hells Angel too, and Lessard had taken him off the kill list. So when Richard watched his younger brother shot down in front of him, he made his choice and did nothing, standing with the killers while his brother died, because the patch on his back had come to outrank the blood in his veins. One man was still alive when Lessard reached him. Laurent Viau, the North Chapter president, lay on the ground with his bare arms raised against the gun above him, and he had no chance, and Lessard knew it. So Lessard crouched down beside the dying man to explain why it was happening to him. "You sniffed too much," he told him. And it was not only the cocaine, it was the police heat their recklessness had brought down on the club, and the money they had stolen from their own brothers in Halifax. Viau heard the reasons, and then Viau was gone. Outside the whole time, Coulombe sat in his car and listened to the gunfire come through the walls, and the prospect who had booked the rooms and packed the bleach finally understood what all of it had been for. He had been building a slaughterhouse. When it was finished, 5 men of the North Chapter were dead. Viau, Geoffrion, Mathieu, Michel Mayrand, and Guy Louis Chop Adam, killed by their own club, in a room full of men who had once called them brothers. Now it was the time for cleanup. The 5 dead men were zipped into the bags Beaulieu had paid cash for, weighted down, driven to the bank of the St. Lawrence near Sorel, and lowered into the cold water, where they were meant to stay forever. And once the bodies were gone, the killers drove to Laval and emptied the dead men's own clubhouse, taking the cash and the drugs, and 6 Harley-Davidsons, dividing up the belongings of men who were still sinking toward the river bottom. By the end of that Sunday, the Hells Angels believed their problem was solved because the North Chapter was gone, The bodies were underwater, and the clubhouse had been stripped clean, so the business could go on as if none of them had ever existed. And for a while, it worked. There were no witnesses left to talk, because the men who had seen it were either killers or bound to silence by the same guns. There were no bodies to find, because the river held them. There were no records, no receipts, no fingerprints, because every trace had been bleached and buried before it was ever made. The most powerful bikers in eastern Canada had murdered 5 of their own and left nothing behind. And for 10 weeks, the perfect crime held exactly as they had built it to. But they had planned for everything a man could plan for, and forgotten the one thing no one controls. The river does not keep its secrets forever. And 10 weeks after the last body went into the water, it gave one of them back. The break did not come from a detective or an informant or a wiretap. It came from a man out fishing on a lazy Saturday afternoon. He was on the water when he found it, the bloated, decaying body of a heavy-set man, wrapped in scraps of what had once been a sleeping bag, the fabric still clinging to the corpse like a bandage to a wound. He called the police at once, and when they pulled the body in and identified it, they finally had what had eluded them for 2 months. It was Jean-Guy Geoffrion, the North Chapter's drug chemist, and an autopsy found he had been shot twice in the head. The police had their first body and their first proof that the whispers were true. For weeks, the police had thrown everything they had at the empty space where 5 men used to be. In April, they had launched raids across the entire province, smashing into Hells Angels bunkers from the Saguenay region down to the South Shore. More than 400 officers moving at once, backed by dogs trained to find bodies, blood, and drugs. They had arrested more than 80 bikers and their associates and seized a small arsenal of handguns and a fortune in narcotics. They had bulldozed their way into the Sherbrooke clubhouse itself and spent days combing the woods behind it with search dogs, certain the graves were there. They came away with almost nothing. A flannel shirt with a bullet hole punched through it, and no bodies to match it to. The Angels jeered that the whole thing was a fishing expedition, a publicity stunt built on suppositions, and on paper they were right, because the police had a mass murder they could not prove, and 5 victims they could not find. On April 15th, they called the search off. Once Geoffrion surfaced, the police turned their whole search to the water, and the evening news filled with strange and grim footage. Motorboats and helicopters and divers working the St. Lawrence. Over the next few days, they pulled up 4 more bodies, every one of them stuffed into a sleeping bag. Some weighted with cinder blocks, others with heavy metal discs, all of them bloated with the gas of decay. Laurent Viau, the North Chapter president, the smallest of the dead men at 5'5", was still curled inside his bag in a fetal position, his arms folded across his chest, as if he had been sleeping. The last of the 5, Jean-Pierre Mathieu, did not surface near the others at all. The last of the 5, Jean-Pierre Mathieu, did not surface near the others at all. His body washed up on a beach near Neuville on June 9th, more than 130 kilometers upriver, carried that impossible distance by the current, even with the chains still wrapped around his legs. The perfect crime was over. The bodies the Hells Angels had sunk to hide forever were laid out on the riverbank for the whole province to see, and the question was no longer whether 5 men had been murdered. It was who had done it, and whether anyone would ever be made to answer for it. For all the meticulous planning, the massacre had one flaw. The list named 6 men to die, and only 5 had walked into that clubhouse. The 6th was the one the leadership most wanted dead. He was the club's own executioner, Yves Trudeau. Trudeau had missed his own execution for the simplest of reasons. A week before the killing, he had checked himself into a drug rehabilitation center in the pine forests of Oka, trying to dry out from a cocaine habit that was costing him $25,000 a week. Cut off from newspapers, television, and radio, as addicts in treatment usually are. He sat in that quiet facility with no idea that his brothers were being shot and sunk in the river, and no idea that his own name had been near the top of the list. The addiction that had marked him for death was the same addiction that placed him, by pure accident, in the one location where the killers could not reach him. Then the outside world came to find him. On the center's designated visiting day, a burly, goateed biker turned up among the worried wives and children who usually filled the room, and he had not come out of concern. His name was Normand Hamill, a man they called Biff, and he had been in that clubhouse in Lennoxville himself. As a North Chapter prospect, Hamill had been handed a choice at gunpoint that day: join the Sorrel Chapter, or line up with the men about to die. He had chosen to live, taken a gun, and stood guard outside with orders to cut down any of his former brothers who tried to run. Now Lessard had sent him to deliver a message to the one who got away. The message was a death notice dressed as an expulsion. Hamill told Trudeau he had been declared dishonorable, that he was to erase every one of his Hells Angels tattoos and surrender his motorcycle. Trudeau understood exactly what that meant. Men were sometimes allowed to retire from the club in good standing, but no one walked away simply by scrubbing off his ink, and certainly no one who had been branded a persona non grata by the leadership. He had turned 39 that February. He had given 17 years to the biker world, first the Popeyes, then the Angels, almost half his life. It was the only family he had, and that family had just told him he was already a dead man. But the club made him one final offer, the kind only the Hells Angels could make. Trudeau could buy his life back. There were still men the club wanted dead, and if their own hitman did the killing, his debt would be paid. So the man who had escaped the massacre went back to work for the people who had tried to have him killed, and one of his assigned targets was another Lennoxville survivor, a spared North Chapter man named Claude Roy, who was murdered 2 weeks after the massacre in a sad little motel room. It was Yves Trudeau's 43rd killing, and it would be his last. The deadliest hitman the Hells Angels ever produced had been spared, humiliated, and put to work by the club that wanted him dead, and it would prove to be the greatest mistake the Quebec Hells Angels ever made. Because they had left the one man alive who could destroy them all, and they had given him every reason to do it. Finding the bodies was not the same as proving who killed them, and the Hells Angels knew it. No one on the outside had seen inside that clubhouse. The men who had witnessed the massacre were either the killers themselves or the handful spared on the condition that they never talk. And the code of silence that protected the club had held through worse than this. To convict anyone, the police needed someone who had been in the room to break that silence. They got 3. The first crack was Jerry Coulombe, the prospect who had rented the motel rooms and delivered the box of bleach. Coulombe had done everything asked of him in hope of a full patch. And when the patch never came, the fear set in that he might be the next loose end the club decided to erase. So he went to the police and told them what he knew, that Lessard had walked him through the plan, that he had heard the gunfire from his car outside. The second was Gilles Lachance, one of the men spared inside the clubhouse, who had watched the executions with a gun trained on him and now turned eyewitness for the Crown. And the third, the most devastating of all, was Yves Trudeau, the escaped executioner who had already begun trading everything he knew for a deal, and whose testimony reached into killing after killing across 15 years. The trials that followed were unlike anything Quebec had seen. The accused bikers were held during hearings inside a specially built bulletproof plexiglass cage, ringed by armed officers who scanned the room for weapons, while every spectator passed through a metal detector, because no one trusted the Hells Angels not to try something even here. Trudeau treated it like a stage. He sauntered into the Sherbrooke courtroom cocky and freshly groomed, a star witness performing for the gallery, slowing as he passed the prisoner's box to lock eyes with the men he was about to bury. But the club was not finished fighting, and it did not confine the fight to the courtroom. During the main trial, a juror named Mario Hamel came forward with a chilling admission. A stranger had approached him and offered him $25,000 to sway the other jurors toward an acquittal. The Hells Angels had reached past the police, past the plexiglass cage, and straight into the jury that was meant to judge them, trying to buy the verdict outright. It was not enough. In the end, 4 men were convicted of first-degree murder for the slaughter at Lennoxville: Réjean Lessard, the architect, along with Luc Michaud, Jacques Pelletier, and Robert Tremblay. Each was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Others were convicted on lesser charges, and some walked free entirely, among them David Carroll, the Halifax leader who had helped set the whole purge in motion but beat the murder charges in court. The man who had gathered the $98,000 and demanded blood for it never answered for the deaths at all. The Hells Angels had murdered their own to make the club stronger. Disciplined, professional, purged of its liabilities, ready to run Quebec like a business. And in the narrowest sense, it worked. The North Chapter was gone, the sniffers were dead, and the men who remained were exactly the cold, profit-focused operators Lessard had wanted. But the massacre did something the killers never anticipated. It created an enemy. Watching the Hells Angels butcher 5 of their own brothers and sink them in the river was a young, ambitious Montreal criminal named Salvatore Cazzetta. Cazzetta had been a friend of a rising angel named Maurice Boucher, close enough that the two might have ended up on the same side. But when Cazzetta saw what the club had done at Lennoxville, killing its own out of greed and paranoia, he was disgusted and he refused to join them. Instead, he built something to stand against them. He founded a rival club, the Rock Machine, dedicated to the one principle Lennoxville had violated, that you do not murder your own. For years, the two forces circled each other. Then, in 1994, it exploded. The Hells Angels under Boucher moved to seize total control of Quebec's drug trade, and Cazzetta's Rock Machine refused to bow, and the result was the Quebec Biker War, the bloodiest gang conflict in Canadian history. More than 160 people would die before it was over. Bombs, assassinations, a murdered child. All of it flowing, in the end, from a single weekend in 1985 when the Hells Angels decided the solution to their problems was to kill their own brothers. The massacre, meant to save the club instead, lit the fuse that nearly destroyed it. The men who planned it? The years were strangely merciful to them. The 4 convicted killers were sentenced to life with no parole for 25 years, but the law let them out sooner, and one by one they were released after serving somewhere between 17 and 22 years. The most remarkable path of all belonged to the architect himself. In prison, Réjean Lessard, the man who had ordered 5 of his brothers executed and crouched beside a dying Viau to tell him why, met an inmate who introduced him to Buddhism. He embraced it completely. By 1989, he had quit the Hells Angels and cut himself off from every biker he had known, and within a few more years he had renounced his possessions so thoroughly that his prison cell sat entirely bare. When he faced the parole board, the man who had assembled a cleanup kit before a killing spoke of reflection and peace. "I am not the same man," he told them. "It's only in prison that I became aware of what a disaster it was." He was granted his freedom. The vegetarian who prayed each day and the executioner who bought sleeping bags for corpses were the same man, 20 years apart. So the story closes the way it began, with a betrayal. It opened with the Hells Angels killing the brothers who had grown too dangerous to keep, and it ended with the survivors reinventing themselves and walking free, while the club they had tried to purify was consumed by the war their purge set loose. The Hells Angels lived by loyalty above all else, and at Lennoxville, they proved that loyalty was the first thing they would kill. The Lennoxville Massacre was supposed to be the end of a problem. Instead, it was the beginning of everything. 5 men in sleeping bags at the bottom of the St. Lawrence, and out of their deaths came the enemy that would drag an entire province into nearly a decade of bombs, assassinations, and blood. Salvatore Cazzetta walked away from that river with a hatred that would define the rest of his life, and the rock machine he built to oppose the Angels would meet them in a war that killed more than 160 people, including an 11-year-old boy on a sidewalk. If Lennoxville was the spark, what came next was the fire. Click the next video to see the war it started, the bloodiest gang conflict Canada has ever known.